The Evening and the Morning takes place around the year 1000.
It's the end of the Dark Ages and the beginning of the Middle Ages. And what we're seeing is a conflict between people who want England to be ruled by law and people who prefer the old ways. So this is the point at which England begins to change, and the main drama of the story comes in conflict about that change.
After The Pillars of the Earth, I wrote two books which took place in the same town, Kingsbridge, in later periods of history. The Evening and the Morning takes place in Kingsbridge at an earlier period of history. The richest source of information about this period of history is what we call the Bayeux Tapestry, which is a sort of enormous comic strip embroidered on linen showing the story of England and Normandy and how the Normans came to be the rulers of England. And the great thing about the Bayeux Tapestry is the details of everyday life.
It's a time when horses were terribly important and a lot of people go places on horseback. So it's important to know what it was like. They didn't have docks. If you wanted to go aboard a ship, you hitched up the skirts of your tunic around your waist and you walked through the shallow water. And in my story, people go between England and Normandy quite a lot. So this depiction is helpful to me. If you want to do historical novels, you've got to get this stuff right.
Now, architecture excites me because it tells of a way of life, you see. We're at Glastonbury Abbey. There has been a monastery here since the 1st century AD, and two of my characters visited at different times. Edgar wants to build a canal and he wants to see how they've done it. Aldred comes here. He is a monk. He comes here to beg a gift. His little monastery is broke, and he thinks that if he can get the relics of a saint, it will attract pilgrims and they will make money out of the pilgrims. I won't tell you whether he gets it. You have to read the book.
The Evening and the Morning certainly has some strong female characters, as my books always do.
When we first meet Ragnar in France, she's already a young woman of importance. She rules over extensive lands, she acts as a judge, but she falls in love with an Anglo-Saxon chieftain, and she goes to England to marry him. She finds that England is relatively lawless and that her husband's family is violent and completely ruthless. But she doesn't just accept this. She cultivates her own allies, she builds her own power base, and she fights back.
Hello.
Welcome.
Wow. One of my characters is a boat builder, Edgar, who is really the hero of the story. The best boats at the time were those of the Vikings. Happily, there is in Oslo a wonderful museum called the Viking Ship Museum.
They have reconstructed the warships in which the Vikings came from Denmark and Norway to raid southern England.
When they attacked towns and villages, they would steal anything valuable that they could carry away, like silver ornaments from the church. They also took the young men and women as slaves.
The worst thing you could see would be 5 or 6 of those damn Viking ships approaching up the river or approaching the beach of your town. Then you knew you were in for hell on earth.
In the opening of my story, the young hero, Edgar, is on the beach at dawn, and coming towards him, this is what he sees, with a dragon's head right at the front. And of course, it's a completely terrifying sight. So here is a dragon's head. Gosh, the carving is extraordinary, isn't it?
The look, the grandeur and the grace of those ships is really a very important image for this book.
For the cover of The Evening and the Morning, for the first time, I've started working with an artist before the book is finished. And so I took Darren Cook, who is a designer who's worked on the covers of my books now for several years. And I took him with me to Oslo because I wanted him to see the helmets And the carving, because I knew that these things would inspire him.
When you see runic letter forms, they locate a piece in history so specifically. A lot of the characters are very similar to an M, a runic M is very similar to an M that we would use today. So there's a really good opportunity here to create a branded look for the title, which is inspired by the runic alphabet.
By the time the book is finished, we will have a very vivid idea of what the cover should look like all over the world. We're in the east of England, not far from the cathedral city of Lincoln. I was very pleased to find Dave Greenhalgh. He's an expert in ancient coins, and he's also a very practical guy, and he has a forge, and he actually makes replica coins in the way that they were made in Anglo-Saxon times. Part of the plot of The Evening and the Morning is that somebody is forging silver pennies, the only money in Anglo-Saxon England.
That can go in.
This is how you make the fire hotter. And all this done with no electricity.
Yep.
They take a pound of silver penny, melt it down, mix it with a pound of copper, and make twice as many pennies as they had before. Double your money. Oof. If you just tried to imagine this, you would have no idea.
A novel is full of physical details of houses and churches and landscapes. All emotional stuff is based on physical description, and all physical description ought to have emotional weight. You've got to make it real in the reader's mind. You've got to make the reader have an emotional reaction to this story. It's a kind of enchantment. I'm in this book, and I really care more about what's going to happen in the next chapter of this book than what's going to happen to me tomorrow. That's a magic spell, and it's actually, in the end, it's the only thing that matters.
Hello, I'm Ken Follett, and I'm delighted to be part of the Raworth's Harrogate Literary Festival. The question that authors are asked most often is, where do you get your ideas? And some authors get bored with this question and make up silly answers like Sainsbury's. But actually, it's quite a good question. Most people aren't constantly bombarded with ideas that come out of their imagination. But that's what happens to us. We live in our imaginations. And when I was a boy, I was always being somebody else. A cowboy, a pirate, captain of a spaceship. And I think other authors are probably the same. I was talking to Lee Child only the other day about this, and he said he was like that as a boy. He was always pretending to be somebody else. And so ideas come to us from our imaginations all the time, pretty much uncontrollably, but an idea is only an idea. An idea for a novel is something a bit special. When readers suggest an idea for a novel to me, it's always, they say something like, this happened to my father in the war, my grandfather in the war. And it's always something that suggests 2 or 3 dramatic scenes. And of course, a novel is built out of something like between 50 and 100 dramatic scenes. And a good idea for a novel must generate that number of dramatic scenes. The novel is told in dramatic scenes. And if you don't have enough of them, you don't have a novel. So an idea for a novel is something a bit special. So the beginning of The Evening and the Morning, our new book, was actually 2 ideas. One was the period of history, round about the year 1000. Evening and the Morning starts in 997, Common Era, and goes on until 1007. And this is a moment in history that is a turning point. It's the end of the Dark Ages and the beginning of the Middle Ages. The Dark Ages had been a time of very little technical progress. In fact, technology went backwards in some respects. In the Dark Ages, literacy declined. and all of the tremendous culture of Greece and Rome was lost in Europe. All the Greek mathematics was lost, philosophy, the theatre. Greeks and Romans had theatres and plays, and in the Dark Ages in Europe there were no theatres and no plays. And then came the Middle Ages, beginning round about this time, the 11th century, and European civilization began to be reborn. Middle Ages led to the Renaissance, and then to the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. So this is a very interesting turning point, and at the same time, three powerful groups were in contest for control of England. The Anglo-Saxons lived here, they thought it belonged to them. The Vikings had been raiding England for 200 years, treating England like a shop where you didn't have to pay, murdering and stealing and taking slaves. And they had settled in large parts of the east of England. I imagine in Harrogate, although I don't know for sure. And then, of course, just across the water, waiting patiently, was probably the most advanced civilization of the three, which was the Normans. And they were ahead of us, and a more sophisticated society, I think. Although historians argue about that, but I think they were. So those three groups, and then, of course, the Normans won and conquered England and ruled England for hundreds of years. But what interested me was that moment when three groups are contending, because a three-way contest is very interesting. There are lots of possibilities for stories in a three-way contest. So I liked that period. And then the second idea had to do with the city of Kingsbridge. Now, this is a fictional city. It's now appeared in three of my books. In The Pillars of the Earth, a great cathedral is built in Kingsbridge. In World Without End, the people of Kingsbridge live and die through the Black Death, a plague much worse than the one that we're experiencing at the moment. And then in A Column of Fire, they live through the terrible religious wars of the 16th century. So this fictional town has gained this identity. It's got fans. There's a website. And a lot of readers are quite interested in the town for its own sake. And I had begun to think, well, what was it like before it was a big, important town? Was it at one stage a village, or maybe less than a village, maybe a little settlement with half a dozen houses up the hill and a little church and a ferry across the river? Wouldn't that be interesting? And what attracted me to that idea was that I could tell the story of how it grew and developed, the story of how Kingsbridge became a big, important city. And I knew that there would be conflicts in that story, you see, because there would be people who liked progress and said, yes, and we must have a marketplace and a cathedral and a bridge over the river. And people who said, let's not change it. We like it the way it is. We don't want disruption. We don't want new people coming in. We don't want new shops opening. We don't want any of that. And that's a conflict that almost all modern readers will say, oh, yes, I recognise that one. Yes, I've come across that. And so I like those two ideas, the big, and that's always really my approach. There's a big political story, a big historical earthquake taking place. And at the same time, there's a group of people who have their own agendas, have their own hopes and fears, and the two interlock. So that was the good idea. Now, on the first day of work on an idea like that, I generally write a very short summary of the story, maybe 3 paragraphs on a sheet of paper. And then I start to ask myself, what happened before? What happened afterwards? Who are these people and where did they come from? And I think about questions like that. The second day of work, I might end up with a whole page, the third day 2 pages, and I keep on asking these questions, and the story grows in an organic way. I spend a long time planning, and I research the period at the same time. Planning and research go together really well, because one day I might think of a scene and realize that I don't know enough about the period to write that scene. I need more details. So the following day I'll read a book about that particular subject. And as well as answering my questions, the book usually will give me ideas for new scenes. And so the two processes of planning and research feed off one another. I plan because I want to write books that never really stop. I want to write books with no boring bits. I want to write books in which each scene leads to the next one, so that you never really want to put it down. You just want to, you keep saying to yourself, oh my goodness, now what's going to happen? I'll just read a few more pages. I like, as a reader, I love that feeling. I love that feeling when you really don't want to stop. And I believe that most readers have the same. Have the same delight in that kind of story. So I try to write that kind of story, and I have to plan in order that there is never a kind of hiatus. There's never a pause. I do the research because the details give the period a sense of reality. That's the point of details. It makes the whole thing feel real. And of course, some of the details of historical periods are rather curious and interesting, and we enjoy them just for themselves. Fun facts. Another reason why I research, which is that I started as a reporter, and in those days we used to get in trouble if anything that was wrong appeared in the paper. I worked for the South Wales Echo, and if somebody's name was spelt wrongly in the paper, that person would phone the editor, and the editor would speak to them and then call me in and say, look, Follett, if you spell his name wrong, he's going to think you've probably got everything else in the story wrong as well. And of course the editor was right, as editors were too often and too tediously. And so I have ended up with a kind of visceral horror of mistakes in what is eventually printed. I hate the idea that there might be mistakes in what is eventually printed. So I became, for both of those reasons, meticulous about the research. And so research and planning, and by the end of a year, generally, I've got a good plan for a story that I think will be thrilling. And I've got a great deal of the research done. I show my plan to my editors and to and friends and family who are quite good at finding weaknesses. And they say to me things like, chapter 3's looking a bit dull. You should liven that up a bit. This character is too much of a victim. I don't like that character. Too ruthless. That sort of thing. And I do like to get these comments at an early stage. I certainly don't want to hear them after the book is in the shops. So I ask for that kind of criticism from editors and from friends and family, and I find it very useful. That takes a year. The process of producing the outline takes a year. I spend a year writing the first draft. At this point, I've got to turn my ideas into living scenes in which flesh and blood people walk in and out of the room and say things and do things. I might have written in the outline, they quarrel, 2 words. And that will have to be 5 or 10 pages of drama in the story, and I will have to think of what they say to each other, how they feel about what the other one is saying, what their surroundings are like, what they hear in the background, what they smell in the air, and how the scene can end in a way that will make you wonder what will happen next. All of that has to be, as it were, grown out of the two words they quarrel. So that's working my imagination the hardest. Now it's not just an idea of pretending I'm a pirate and having adventures. Now my imagination is working within constraints. There's an outline of the story, and my imagination has to fill in the details and make it come alive. That second year is the hardest part of writing the novel. And then I send it, once again, I show it to people. At this point, I show it in addition to historical consultants. And I ask them, I pay them actually quite well, because I want them to take it seriously. I pay them to read my draft and give me a report suggesting corrections. And this is so that if I have made any mistakes in my research, or if I've even done anything that isn't really wrong but is sort of not right either, not very good for the era, then they will point that out. And I can correct it before it goes to the printer. And the third year is rewriting. And I do completely rewrite. I don't edit. I don't cross things out and scribble on the bits of paper. Or delete and rewrite in Word. I key the whole thing again, and the reason for that is that it's not until I actually key the sentence that I can see its weaknesses. If I just read it, I've got a bit of an inclination to think it's wonderful. So I key it again, long process. People say, isn't that tedious? Actually, it's not, because everything I do is making the book a little bit better. And I find that quite satisfying. So that's my process. I think all the time all through this process, I think about the reader. Some of my friends say, I don't write for other people, I write for myself. I write what I think is good. And if other people like it, it's great, and I'm very pleased, but that's not what I'm aiming for. I've always been the opposite of that, absolutely the opposite. I don't write for myself. I write because I want to enchant people. I want people to enter my imaginary world and find it so fascinating that they don't want to leave. It's always been my approach, and I think anybody who wants to be a popular novelist has got to some extent think that way. Take descriptions, for example. You can write half a page or a page describing a landscape or a house or a person, and it can be really tedious. If you're going to describe something, let's say you're going to describe a house, of course you want the reader to have a picture in her mind or his mind, having read that paragraph, a picture of a house, but you've got to do more than that. You've got to create an atmosphere. If the house is going to mean anything in the story, then what will it be like? In a traditional Gothic, of course, it's a menacing house, but it can be many other things. It can be a welcoming place that's happy. It can be a tumble-down place that suggests poverty and difficulty. It ought to suggest something to the reader that's not just, what it looks like and what it's made of. The same with descriptions of people. And it's not that the bad guys have got to have little beady eyes and the good guys got to have a blonde beard, It's not that sort of frightfully straightforward, and it's not the kind of stuff that's going to make the reader say, oh, of course he's got little beady eyes. But it can be more subtle than that. And you can describe an extremely handsome man and suggest something hidden about him that will eventually reveal itself and show that he is not actually an attractive character. He's actually some kind of villain. Without descriptions must give us something other than the look of a person or the look of a landscape or a house. Realism is terribly important. Of course, most good stories are completely unrealistic, aren't they? I mean, most good stories are things about things that could hardly happen or are very unlikely to happen. And I don't mean coincidence. I mean just exceptional behavior and exceptional people, characters who are a little bit larger than life. And that's what good stories are about. But in order to render them convincing, you need to have realism in the way the story is told and in the background. And that's indeed where historical details will come in. Well, perhaps that's enough of me talking to camera. I've got some questions that have been sent in by readers to the festival, and I've been asked to answer them. And that's what I'm going to do next, after I take a short break. My first question is, your characters are amazing, especially Jack from Pillars of the Earth. Do you build their personalities, or are they based on people you know? They're never based on people I know. I might use odd characteristics, somebody who has, I don't know, a nervous way of pulling his ear or something like that. I might use that if I thought it interesting or revealed something about his character. But I don't use real people in any way other than that particularly trivial way. I build them up, and here's the reason. The important thing to me is the story. The story determines the characters. The characters don't determine the story for me. I want to be sure that the story is good and has got your interest, and the characters have to be people who will do the things that create a good story. You see, you can't tell a good story about people who are timid and cautious, because nothing ever happens to those people. They're, they never get into trouble. They never take risks. And so the characters in an interesting, exciting story are always people who are got a little bit of a tendency to be foolhardy. They'll say, "Oh, it'll be all right," and they'll take a chance, and then they'll have to extricate themselves from a situation. So I create personalities who have good reasons for doing some of the things that I want them to do. So, for example, in The Evening and the Morning, Ragnar, who is my favourite person in this story, I want her, she's a Norman princess, and I want her to come to England, where most of the action of this story is taking place. So I give her a good reason to. She rebels against her parents. Her parents want her to marry a young man who is a cousin of the King of France. And she says, forget it, he's a wimp, I don't like him at all, I'm not marrying him. And she falls in love with an Anglo-Saxon ealdorman, chieftain, and she goes to England to marry him. Voila, there's my reason for Ragnar coming to England. But you can see how already I've been obliged to make her a rebel. Somebody who doesn't do what she's told. She's disobedient and she's passionate. She's not going to marry this milk and water cousin of the king. She wants to marry this rather dangerous but rather sexy Anglo-Saxon chieftain. And that's how it works with me, with my characters. They don't create the story. The story demands that I create that character. Here's another question. The amount of research you put into each novel is astonishing. I do not think I would be able to cope doing that alongside writing a book. Is it something that you love, that drives your creativity? And how do you go about starting research on a new time period or area? Well, research is something that I enjoy. I wouldn't say I love it. I enjoy it partly because it's easier than writing. That's why all the authors like the research. But it does drive my creativity. I read about some aspect of medieval life or life in the Dark Ages, and I think, oh my goodness. I'll give you an example. During the course of researching The Evening and the Morning, I realized that slavery was a much larger phenomenon in England at this time than I had previously appreciated. 1 person in 10 in England was a slave. It's a huge slave population. And it means that the society has to be depicted in a completely different way. Slavery is not a peripheral or occasional thing. Slavery is a big thing in English society, and it's got to be represented in the book, and at least one slave has to be an important character in the story. Otherwise, it's a misrepresentation of the society at the time. But of course, that's inspiring. And okay, you've got a slave society. You're going to have a slave in the story. What is going to happen to him or her? And will as it happens in the evening and the morning, the important slave is a woman. Is she going to escape? She falls in love with somebody. Even slaves fall in love with people. She falls in love with a free man. What's going to happen? That kind of thing is exactly how research drives creativity. There's that fact. 10% of the population were slaves. And you can see how that immediately drives a whole series of thoughts which end up in a drama. And there is a big drama associated with the slave, Blood, her name is, in the evening and the morning. And it came directly from the research. If you incorporate an actual historical figure into your plot, how do you balance the historical facts within the fiction? How do you gauge how much you deviate from this person's true history? No, I would never deviate from the person's true history. It's true, there are real historical characters in the evening and the morning, and more of them in my 20th century trilogy. There are many more real-life characters. In the evening and the morning, we don't know the names of many of the real-life characters at this period of time. We know the name of the king and his wives, and we know the name of the Archbishop of Canterbury. But by and large, we don't know many real people. But if it is a real person, I would never write something that contradicted what is actually known about his history. I might make something up that isn't known. And in the case of Ethelred, of course, it's not known where the Anglo-Saxon king was at any particular time. May occasionally say he was at Winchester at Easter, but even that's a bit rare. Or it might say that he went to Strathclyde, but it won't say which month or date. So you're obliged to make something up. Later, when I did the Century Trilogy, of course, I couldn't do that with people like President Kennedy because somebody somewhere knows what President Kennedy was doing every day that he was President of the United States. So you're a bit freer in that respect with an Anglo-Saxon figure. I'll give you an example of mixing. Now, you may say, okay, what happens when a fictional character meets a real historical character? Because clearly that never happened by definition of a fictional character. So how do I handle that? And I'll give you an example. In Fall of Giants, which is the first book in the Century Trilogy, there's a scene in which the Prime Minister, Lloyd George, this is in about 1920, Prime Minister Lloyd George goes to a party. In those days, Prime Ministers didn't have so much to do, and they quite often went to parties in the evening, and he meets a fictional character called Fitz. And Fitz berates him. Fitz says, there are 2 Bolsheviks from Russia going around England, talking to working class people and trying to turn them communists. And you, Prime Minister, should expel these 2 Bolsheviks, these 2 Russian Bolsheviks. We don't want them here stirring up trouble. And Lloyd George said, the more the English working man knows about Bolshevism, the less he will like it. Bolshevism is best viewed at a great distance through rose-coloured glasses. And of course, Lloyd George was right. These dogmatic bullying Russian Bolsheviks didn't get much of a response from the English factory workers that they were going around following. The people didn't like them very much. Whereas, if the Prime Minister had expelled them from the country, there would have been a big fuss. He was against free speech. He was trying to stifle debate and all that kind of thing. Now, that's a fictional scene, but everything that Lloyd George says in that scene, he wrote down at the time, because there were many people saying to him what Fitz said to him: you should expel these Bolsheviks from our country. And he sent out a memo explaining why he didn't want to expel them. And he said all of that. The more the English workman knows about Bolshevism, the less he will like it, and so on, all those remarks. So I put into his mouth, in this fictional scene, things that he had actually said, not actually said, had actually written down in a discussion about this very topic. And that's sort of an ideal. You can have the real life character say something in a fictional scene or do something in a fictional scene, so long as you're confident that those words or those actions represent something that he really would have done and is not a variation. I would not have liked, I wouldn't have Lloyd George admit to being a secret Bolshevik and having kept this under his hat ever since the Russian Revolution, because that would be counter to everything that is known about Lloyd George, and I would feel that was laughable and ridiculous, so I would never do that. And my last question, and I have the name of this questioner, his name is Mike Cross. Ken, it is too long to wait between your new books. I agree. I wish I could write them faster. Can you suggest another author who could keep us entertained in the interim? Okay, it is a long time between my books. These long historical novels are taking me 3 years, or very nearly 3 years now. It's a long time, but I think it's worth it, and you seem to think it's worth it. Readers seem to think. Readers seem to love the long historical novels that I've written in the last few years. Readers seem to love. People like my thrillers, but this kind of story seems to stay with people longer. People remember it longer. It seems to make a bigger impact. It seems to absorb people more. And I think it's because in a long novel, you really get pulled into the lives of these characters, and you see them over quite a long period of time. Most novels are like a snapshot of the characters in the middle of their lives. And a long novel, you see much more development of their life. You see that some of their hopes and fears happen, and they think, they hope long term for something, and you find out whether they get it or not, and they're fearful of something that might happen to them, and you find out the answer to that over a 5-year period. And that, I find that very interesting to write, and it seems very much that readers find that more interesting to read. So that's why, and I'm afraid I plan to continue to write long books. It's hard, of course. It's with a ordinary novel like a thriller, you write 100,000 words and you're done, and you can start again with a new idea and new characters and new setting. But with a book like The Pillars of the Earth, you write 100,000 words and you've hardly got started. So it is, and you have to keep up. You have to invent much more story about the same people. So it is difficult, but it's worth it. I think it's worth it. Readers seem to think it's worth it. So I'm afraid, Mike Cross, it's going to continue exactly that way. I'm going to continue taking a long time, because I think in the end you'll enjoy it more. Can I suggest another author? Look, I'm here to promote myself. Now, who else? I'm not sure who else would be good. You see, I'm kind of very much a Victorian novelist. I have cast of characters, and there's a plot, and there are developments, and it's hard to think of a contemporary. But look, if you haven't read Trollope, Anthony Trollope, he is one of my great favourites, and I even reread his books, which is quite a compliment. I don't reread many books. But Trollope's long novels about Barchester Towers, about the Palliser family, and standalone long novels like Orley Farm, I think you might find that they have quite a lot in common with the books of mine that you like. And you might well find that Trollope is actually better, and you might start reading him instead of me, which that's the nature of the game. But I think at any rate, a lot of people would get the same kind of satisfactions out of a Trollope as they get out of a Ken Follett book. That's the end of the questions. And just to finish off, I wonder if you'd like to hear a scene from the evening and the morning. This is the opening scene from chapter 9. It takes place in mid-September in the year 997 Common Era. Ragnar set off from Cherbourg with a heart full of happy anticipation. She had triumphed over her parents, and she was going to England to marry the man she loved. The whole town came to the waterfront to cheer her off. Her ship, the Angel, had a single mast with a large multicoloured sail, plus 16 pairs of oars. The figurehead was a carved angel blowing a trumpet, and at the stern a long tail curved up and forward to terminate in a lion's head. Its captain was a wiry greybeard called Guy, who'd crossed the Channel to England many times before. Ragnar had sailed in a ship only once. 3 years ago, she'd gone with her father to Fécamp, 90 miles across the Bay of Seine, never far from land. The weather had been good, the sea had been calm, and the sailors had been charmed to have a beautiful young noblewoman aboard. The trip had been pleasantly uneventful, so she'd been looking forward eagerly to this journey, the first of many new adventures. She knew, in theory, that any sea voyage was hazardous, but she could not help feeling exhilarated. It was her nature. You could spoil anything by worrying too much. She was accompanied by her maid Cat, Agnes, her best seamstress, 3 other maids, plus Bern the giant, and 6 more men-at-arms to protect her. She and Bern had horses. Hers was her favourite, Astrid, and they took 4 ponies to carry the baggage. Ragnar had packed 4 new dresses and 6 new pairs of shoes. She also had a small personal wedding gift for Wilwolf, a belt of soft leather with a silver buckle and strap end, packed in its own special box. The horses were tethered on board with straw underfoot for a measure of cushioning in case the motion of the sea should cause them to fall. With a crew of 20, the ship was crowded. They set off in warm sunshine, with a brisk southwesterly wind that promised to take them to Coombe in a couple of days. Now, for the first time, Ragnar became anxious. Wilwolf loved her, but he might have changed. She was eager to make friends with his family and his subjects, but would they like her? Would she be able to win their affection? Or would they disdain her foreign ways and even resent her wealth and beauty? Would she like England? To banish such worries, Ragnar and her maids practiced speaking Anglo-Saxon. Ragnar had been taking lessons every day from an Englishwoman married to a Cherbourg man. Now she made the others giggle by telling them the words for the different male and female parts of the body. Then, with hardly any warning, the summer breeze turned into an autumn storm, and cold rain whipped the ship and all its passengers. There was no shelter. Ragnar had once seen a gaily painted river barge with a canopy to shade noble ladies from the heat of the sun, but apart from that, she'd never come across a ship with any kind of cabin or protective roof. When it rained, passengers and crew and cargo alike all got wet. Ragnar and her maids huddled together pulling the hoods of their cloaks over their heads, trying to keep their feet out of the pools that gathered in the bottom. But that was only the beginning. They stopped smiling as the wind turned into a gale. Captain Guy seemed calm, but he lowered the sail for fear of capsizing. Now the ship went where the weather took it. The stars were hidden behind clouds, and even the crew did not know which way they were heading. Ragnar began to be scared. The crew dropped a sea anchor off the stern. This was a big sack that filled with water and acted as a drag on the ship, moderating its motion and keeping the stern to the wind. But the swell grew. The ship pitched violently. The Angel blew his trumpet, up at the black sky, then, a second later, down into the rolling deeps. The horses could not keep their footing and fell to their knees, neighing in terror. The men-at-arms tried to calm them without success. Water slopped over the sides. Some of the crew started to say prayers. Ragnar began to think she would never get to England. Perhaps she was not destined to marry Wilwolf and have his children. She might die and go to hell to be punished for the sin she'd committed in making love to him before they were husband and wife. She made the mistake of picturing what it would be like to drown. She recalled a childhood game of holding her breath to see how long she could keep it up, and she felt the panic that had come over her after a minute or two. She imagined the terror of being so desperate to breathe that she inhaled lungfuls of water. How long did it take to die? The thought made her feel ill, and she threw up the dinner she'd enjoyed in sunshine only a couple of hours earlier. Vomiting failed to quiet her stomach, but nausea took away her fear, for now she hardly cared whether she lived or died. She felt as if it would go on forever. When she could no longer see the rain falling, she realized it was night. The temperature dropped, and she shivered in her sodden clothing. She had no idea how long the storm had continued when at last it eased. The downpour became a drizzle, and the wind dropped. The ship drifted in the dark. It carried lamps and a jar of oil in a waterproof chest, but there was no fire with which to light them. Captain Guy said he might have raised the sail if he'd known for sure that they were far from land, but with no knowledge of the ship's position and no light by which to see signs that land was near, it was too dangerous. They had to wait for day to restore their vision. When dawn came, Ragnar saw that his caution had been wise. They were within sight of cliffs. The sky was clouded, but the clouds were brighter in one direction, which must therefore be east. The land to the north of them was England. The crew went quickly to work, despite the continuing rain. First they raised the sail, then they gave out cider and bread for breakfast, then they baled the water from the bottom of the ship. Ragnar was amazed that they could simply resume their duties. They'd all nearly died. How could they act normally? She could hardly think of anything but the fact that she was still miraculously alive. They sailed along the coast until they saw a small harbour with a few boats. The captain did not know the place, but he guessed they might be 40 or 50 miles east of Combe. He turned the ship landward and sailed into the harbour. Suddenly Ragnar longed for the feeling of firm ground beneath her feet. The ship was taken into shallow water. Then Ragnar was carried through the shallows to a pebble beach. With her maids and bodyguards, she climbed the slope to the waterfront village and went into an alehouse. Ragnar was hoping for a roaring fire and a hot breakfast, but it was early in the day. The fire was low, and the hostess was tousled and grumpy, rubbing sleep from her eyes as she tossed sticks onto a feeble flame. Ragnar sat shivering, waiting for her luggage to be unloaded so that she could put on dry clothing. The hostess brought stale bread and weak ale. "Welcome to England," she said.